Hello and welcome to what will hopefully be a shorter version of Lecture 5, The Effects of Climate Change. Lecture 4, we talked about what climate change was, maybe potential agents causing global climate change. We talked a little bit about greenhouse gases and global warming. Now we're going to look at the effects of climate change on different parts of the Earth and even us a little bit. First off, some of the consequences of a warmer Earth. The idea that the Earth is warmer now than it was before. I mean, we look at temperature data and we see these general trends. Doesn't mean that it's warmer every minute of every day than it was on that same minute and day the year before or whatever, but it means that if we look at a general average of all over the world throughout the year, we see a trend of it going up. And some of the things we notice are we see birds nesting earlier than they used to. We see plants flowering earlier than they used to. And so this plays a role in the life cycle of those plants, those birds, and those plants and birds, and the ecosystems that they live in. Also, because of this, we could eventually see serious problems. Keyword is potentially. These are projections, just based on data we have and what we know of the past. So we could see large changes in weather patterns, mostly more severe storms, maybe even less predictable weather than we have seen. More instances of unstable weather, really cold times followed by unseasonably warm times. I mean, think about this year. We had our coldest February ever on record, but it was in the mid-60s this past Christmas 2014. It was mid-60s. I went golfing on the day after Christmas. Yet February, a couple months later, February 2015 was even colder. So we have to take that into consideration and also know that the response will be different everywhere and different countries will respond differently. Rising sea levels, we've seen this happening over the past 100 years since we've been taking the measuring. The sea levels seem to be rising up. And they will probably continue to rise for a couple of reasons. The obvious one is that ice currently over land is melting. So ice that's over land is frozen water on land now is entering the water again. If the ice was floating in the water, buoyancy and density and everything would cause the level to be the same. The other reason why sea levels are rising is because as water warms, it expands. All right, as you get above 4 degrees Celsius in water, it starts to then start expanding and taking up more space. So these two factors together, ice melting and the water itself getting warmer and expanding, is causing the sea levels to rise. And this can cause the flooding of coastal areas, such as like Manhattan or New Orleans. New Orleans is actually underwater. And also might change the salinity, the amount of salt in some coastal freshwater regions, which could affect the aquatic life in those regions and change ecosystems and decrease freshwater resources, which could play a big role in our future, especially if freshwater becomes more scarce than it already is. If we continue to see the Earth warming up, we could see the surface of the oceans absorbing more heat energy, which means storms that form from the oceans, from the energy of the evaporating water in the oceans, could become more intense, specifically hurricanes and typhoons. We could see some major ocean current patterns, such as the Gulf Stream change, which right now the Gulf Stream brings warm water from the Caribbean up into the North Atlantic and over Western Europe. So it's why places in Western Europe at the same latitude that we are generally a more stable, warmer temperature than we are. They're getting extra warm air from the Gulf Stream ocean current carrying warm water and therefore warm air with it. Shutting this down could put Europe in an ice age. Or not necessarily an ice age, but could see dramatic reductions in temperature of Western Europe, and it could get a lot colder in places like England and France and Germany, which would have a big impact. We could also see a change in precipitation patterns, and severe flooding could occur in some regions, while other regions, droughts and fires could pop up. And we're kind of seeing this whole drought and fire idea on our west coast, where they're going through a drought right now, and we see stories every summer about giant forest fires that we know are normal, but they seem to be getting more common and more out of control with each passing year. There could be problems to human health. All right. Obviously, if it's warmer, there could be more heat-related deaths. Okay, that's kind of follows through. But some other problems and issues that might arise that we might not normally think of, if we have trees and plants flowering earlier, we could cause people with pollen allergies to suffer from the allergies longer. And it doesn't seem like it's not going to come wipe out the human race or totally destroy us as a species, but it will decrease our quality of life, which is a big thing. Also, warmer temperatures will allow insects like mosquitoes to be able to breed earlier in the season and take hold earlier in the season. We know they're big vectors or carriers of diseases like malaria, among others. And it could just even introduce these mosquitoes into areas that are typically too cold for them, so a little bit north of us. I mean, as it is, our mosquito season's like 3 months long at worst. So imagine if that goes to 5 months long. Now we have to deal with these biting bugs for a few months longer, and there's more of a chance that mosquitoes can carry diseases from people to people here. Agriculture is affected. If the weather or if extreme weather events like droughts or floods become more frequent, that's going to play a role in the crops of that area. Higher temperatures tend to decrease crop yields because the plants are not used to the type of heat. And also the demand for irrigation, demand for fresh water could increase. All right, and we could deplete overused aquifers, and we'll talk more about aquifers as we go through the water units that are coming up. But pretty much what we're looking at is that fresh water is going to become more in demand, and since we live in an area with a lot of fresh water, because we're right at the Great Lakes, that means our area could become very important in the future. Now keep in mind, this is all speculation based on the data we're currently seeing and basing it on events that we have seen now and in the past. All right, I say this area could become very important because we have a lot of fresh water. All right, think of an area that has a very important resource right now. It's not the most stable area on the planet. Okay, I'm talking about oil in the Middle East. It's not that stable. Because everybody wants the oil. Well, that could easily happen to the Great Lakes area. Everybody could want the water. And so there could be fighting over the Great Lakes, either between us, between different parts of the U.S. itself, between the U.S. and Canada, and who knows if other countries decide to invade to try to take that water. When we just talked about agriculture being affected, those are types of plants, but we could also see a change in the range of plant species, change in the composition of plant communities, trees moving northward. All right, trees that normally don't colonize as far north could move farther north, changing the biomes a little bit, changing the ecosystems. So we could lose and see forests shrink in warmer areas, which are the rainforests, really diverse areas, and see more and more forests pop up in the more northern or southern latitudes, at those more extreme latitudes, and just change overall the idea of diversity as a whole in the world. You just these plants could be influenced just so much by climate change and just migrating to different areas. If the plants are showing changes, the animals would show a shift in their geographic ranges as well. All right, northern birds might not fly as far south, but to me, the big thing is zooplankton and algae could be affected by warmer waters, which would disrupt food webs in either coral reefs or in other parts of the oceans. Just these are those low trophic level organisms that food webs and food chains rely upon, and the stability of ecosystems rely upon these. So a change in their environment that makes it more hospitable for them means that or more hostile for them, means that those populations need to be able to adapt. And they're so dependent upon for everything else in their ecosystem that something happens to all the food, well, then the things that eat the food, something happens to them eventually too. So that brings us to the recent findings. And again, everything I talked about, I kind of hit the negative side, which I didn't do as much in the longer version. I tried to really balance that out a little more. Keep in mind, those are projections. Those are based upon data we currently have, and using that data that we have or we've collected in the past and knowing how events seem to work, we're taking our best shots at where this could go. And one of the reasons why on the news you see so many of the negatives and the doomsday scenarios is that they're more entertaining. Entertainment sells ad time, so people are more likely to watch it. People want to be entertained as well as being informed. Recent findings back in 2007, so they're not all that recent, but they are the fourth assessment report, came after the third assessment report. The third one was in 2001. We noticed between 01 and 07 a global surface temperature increase by 0.74 degrees Celsius. So this is if we take all the surface temperatures that were measured and do an average for 2001, do an average for 2007, we saw that the average was 0.74 degrees Celsius higher. Doesn't seem like a whole lot. All right. But that's only in a 6-year span, so kind of multiply that out. All right. That means in a 12-year span, it's probably 1.5 degrees Celsius. Or in a 24-year span, now you're looking at 3 degrees Celsius. In a lifetime, let's say 72 years, you're looking at 9 degrees Celsius. So this is where those projections really start to run wild if things stay at the current rate. They take the worst case scenarios, point those forward because they think that will almost scare people in wanting to act more, and people push their agendas. We saw an increase in both the global averages, and we saw that it was higher at the northern latitudes. The farther north you got, you saw that. We also noticed that the global sea level has continued to rise, and the concentration of greenhouse gases has continued to increase. All right, and it should all make sense. The more greenhouse gases are in the air, the more heat is retained by the earth, which causes water to warm up and expand and more ice to melt, which causes sea level to rise. And so it kind of all feeds into itself. To reduce the risk, we need to work as a global community. All right, some nations have done more than others. Reforestation projects have been there to help reduce carbon dioxide, but we're still cutting down more trees than we're planting as a globe as a whole. And it's difficult because of the economic, political, and social factors of all the different countries. Different countries are in different places economically and socially, and so they're going to have different views on how they should spend their money. Think back to the Cool It documentary we watched. You saw the guy asking the kids in Kenya, in Nairobi, Kenya, there, what their biggest fears are, and most of them are saying health care and food, and some of them are saying shelter. Not a whole lot of them are talking about climate change and global warming, where over in a more developed nation, where food and shelter and healthcare are much more abundant, we see more people worried about climate change. So it's easier for us to focus our attention there than for a developing nation that needs to solve other problems first that might not be as pressing. It's pretty much the main reason I wanted to show Cool It, just to show you that not the whole world is in the same place we are, but we can still do our part to help. And then when other countries get to a place where they're not worrying about the essentials like food and shelter and healthcare and healthiness, we can eventually help them along to try to even help pick up the earth even more. Because even with the major problems we've had over the last 50 years, they are getting better. We need to remember that. In the 70s, rivers in Ohio were catching on fire. They're not that polluted anymore. We've done a better job, and we continue to do a better job. So this kind of talks about what I've already talked about, is there's already this rift between developed and undeveloped countries. A lot of it has to do with CO2 emissions because fossil fuels are the cheapest energy source still right now. And what we're noticing is more of an equal sharing of the amount of CO2 emissions by 2035. But this has to do with a percentage, not by a total number. The total number of CO2 emissions is going up. It's just developing countries are taking a bigger percentage. We'll see a graph in a minute. All right, the Kyoto Protocol tried to fix this. It was a treaty negotiated in 1990. Many countries ratified it, mostly European, but not a lot of the most responsible ones. The United States did not ratify it. Canada did not ratify it. Australia did not ratify it. A lot of Western Europe did, but if we wanted to do something on a global scale, we need the entire globe to work together. And I just don't think we are there yet. Here's that graph I was telling you about. Here is 1995. You can see developed countries release 73% of the CO2 released in 2035. Of CO2 released in 1995. In 2035, 40 years later, we project it to be more of an even split. But keep in mind, the total amount of CO2 also increases. All right. There will be more CO2 released in 2035 than in 1995. The amount released is not going to be the same number of tons of CO2 or whatever, or liters of CO2 or whatever volume of measurements you want to look at. Whatever unit of measurement, there will be more in 2035. It'll just be more equally distributed than it was in 1995. So while the U.S. amount could actually be more, maybe 15% is 50 trillion tons. I'm pulling numbers out of nowhere. In 2035, maybe it was only 40 trillion tons in 1995. So the amount the U.S. released went up, but its percentage went down because so many more countries were releasing CO2. The big thing is to try to find a way for these developed countries to reduce their CO2 so that as these developing countries release more, overall we don't see as much of a big increase. That's the big thing. So I hope this one was a little shorter for you, and if you chose to watch it, I think you got just as much of the in-depth stuff. I definitely didn't talk about most of the information being projections and estimates and what that all means as much, just to kind of cut down a little bit of time. Obviously, I have a lot to say about this subject. If you want to hear me say more, go watch the long version. All right, bring in questions, and have a good night.